Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Marcia Hyde from 42 Bedford Row, and this is the first animal welfare webinar in the series that we will be running this year. You will see on our website the other topics we will be dealing with in webinars. But for tonight, we are going to look at prospective animal welfare legislation that's currently winding its way, some of it more slowly than others, through Parliament at the moment. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Paula Sparks from A-Law, who's going to help me discuss the legislation we're going to look at tonight. So welcome, Paula.
Hi, hello. Thank you for inviting me to join this webinar. I was really excited about this.
It's a pleasure. And Paula, just give us an idea about A-Law. A-Law is a charity, and what's the aims of A-Law?
So we're an animal law charity. Our vision is a world where animal interests are fully protected by law. So we are about all things animal law. We publish an animal law journal. We host events. We are involved with animal advocacy and law reform, and identifying areas of opportunity to do better through the law for animals, so to achieve animal welfare objectives by the law. We're volunteer led, and so we're your organisation as well as our organisation.
All right, thank you. So Paula, tonight we're going to look at legislation going through Parliament. Let me just tell you the format we're going to do today. We're going to look at three pieces of legislation. We're going to look at the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill, and we'll probably spend a lot of time on that because it's a big piece of legislation. We're then going to look at the Trophy Hunting Bill, and then we're going to look at the Low Welfare Activities Abroad Bill. And what we've decided to do is break those pieces of legislation down into topics and then break them down again by Paula looking at the welfare issues on those topics that have given rise to the legislation, well, the proposed legislation currently in Parliament. And then I'm going to look at the provisions in the different acts. And then we're going to have a little chat at the end of each topic to see whether or not the provisions meet the welfare needs that generated them. So that's how we're going to do it. So I'm going to start off, if I can, with the Animal Welfare Kept Animals Bill. And we're going to firstly look at keeping, selling and breeding primates. We're then going to look at exports of livestock for fattening and slaughter, then pet theft. We're going to look at import restrictions on dogs, cats and ferrets. Now, the bill also covers provisions for zoos and also for livestock worrying. But we're not going to deal with those two tonight because we just don't have time to do everything. So that's what we're going to look at. This, as I say, is a big piece of legislation. It's kind of stalled in Parliament at the moment. It was first introduced in June 2021. It went through its second reading in the House of Commons in October 2021. And was in the committee stage in November 2021, and then nothing's happened. And I think people were so worried about nothing happening. There was a national petition which reached 100,000, and once you reach that, then the government has to debate it. And that debate in Parliament took place on the 5th of December last year. And really it was about, well, when are we going to get this bill to a royal assent? Now, both sides of the House said, we want to pass this bill, we want it into legislation. The government promised it was going to make time to get it through the Commons and into the Lords, but it hasn't done anything yet. So we are still stuck in the House of Commons with it. So it's still very much a work in process and progress. So I'll deal with it as it is currently in Parliament and also how it has currently been amended as best as I can. So the first thing then we're going to look at is keeping, selling and breeding primates. And I'm going to now hand over to Paula to tell us what the welfare issues are on that topic.
I think probably no one will be surprised at the fact that welfare concerns have been raised around people keeping primates as companion animals. So we know there's an estimated 148 to 448 primate species, according to how you decide to classify those species. But they all have in common that they are wild, non-domesticated animals, and keeping them in a domesticated setting and trying to domesticate them is arguably very concerning in terms of their welfare. I think some of the welfare issues that have been identified, and the RSPCA were involved with this Bristol study that looked at the health and welfare concerns about primates kept in the UK, included concerns around the need for a specialist diet, for a specialist environment, and opportunities for socialization, not only with other primates of the same species, but within the family group as well. So with siblings or with their mother, or other members of the family. And another concern is this around the life expectancy of a primate. So a primate could live for up to around 50 or 60 years. Now, if that means that they are dependent upon one owner or keeper, and whose circumstances may change over a period of time, that obviously gives rise to welfare concerns that they can be subject to be rehomed and rehomed time after time, or end up in a laboratory, which is different from primates being kept in, say, a zoo or a sanctuary environment. There are also concerns around what the process is of taking primates from the wild in other countries, what impact that has in terms of conservation, the impact on local biodiversity. And I think this is also part of a much wider discussion that we're starting to have now, and probably accelerated by concerns about zoonotic disease risk. To what extent should people be able to keep exotic, that's non-native wild animals that have come from other countries, in a domesticated setting? And there has been some movement on this in other countries that have developed either positive lists of species that can be kept in a way that's commensurate with meeting their welfare needs and without having an impact on the country of origin, or having negative lists setting out those species that shouldn't be kept as domestic pets. So I've put up here, there is a link in the slides to the ALAW report that was the consultation response to DEFRA on this issue, for anyone who wants to have a more in-depth analysis. And one of our volunteers, Rob Espin, drafted and led this, and there's a lot more detail in here than I can obviously go into today.
Great, thank you, Paula. So I'm going to look now at some provisions of what the bill does in respect of primates, and I'm going to first of all look at licenses. The bill creates, and this is really for individual keepers, it's not for zoos, it creates an offence of keeping a primate without a license. And to get that license, you must meet minimum welfare standards, which deal with environment, diet, handling, transportation, protection from pain and suffering, and also meeting behavioural needs. So that's the Section 1 conditions of having a licence. The licenses can last for a maximum of 6 years, and they can contain specific conditions about how and what you are to do in respect of the particular animal. There must be at least 2 inspections during those 6 years. And they must be revoked. The license must be revoked if a keeper commits an offence under the Animal Welfare Act or under other sections of the bill. So that's licenses, rectification notices and suspension periods. the bill creates a system of rectification notices, and all of these matters are run and organised by the local authorities where the primate is. A rectification notice gives a direction to a keeper holding a licence to bring conditions up to standards if they've dropped. The notice can last for a maximum period of 2 years, during which proceedings can commence, which proceedings can't commence. So if you are not meeting standards, then the authority can issue a rectification notice. And once they've done that, you've got 2 things to put things right, or to bring the conditions up to standards. It's an offence, or will be an offence, not to comply with a rectification notice. The bill also creates suspension periods, and that gives a keeper time to bring welfare standards up to scratch without a licence until they get a licence. And again, when that happens during a suspension period, the local authority can set directions for basic welfare standards during that period, which includes things like you must register the animal with a vet, it's got to have animal health checks, there may be a direction as to neutering, and there's quite wide powers on the suspension periods. The suspension period can be revoked. Now, what I can't find in the bill, and I'll keep searching, is the maximum period of time that a suspension period can last for, and that's something we might need to talk about. The next matter is breeding and selling. The bill creates an offence of selling to another if you know or have reasonable grounds to suspect that the animal will be kept in conditions in breach of Section 1, the standards, the welfare standards that are prescribed. It creates an offence to allow breeding without a licence, and it creates an offence to keep 2 or more primates which are not neutered without a licence. There's some quite high penalties, fines for breaches for most of the offences, fixed penalty notices under the Schedule 2. Fixed penalty notice is in lieu of a conviction, so it's a bit like a driving conviction. It's £5,000 in lieu of a conviction, but you have to have admitted the offence. It also creates a system of forfeiture as a penalty. If you're convicted under Schedule 1 or issued with a fixed penalty notice, then the forfeiture notice can kick in and make you hand over the animal to another, for example, a zoo or other keeper who is licensed and is approved. You could, it may force you to sell or otherwise dispose of the animal. And it also allows for putting the animal down, and that includes pregnant primates. The provision is there is a provision in the bill to extend to other wild animals, but that's still in debate. So those are the basic provisions that meet the welfare needs for keeping primates, or do they? Paula, what do you think? Are they good enough? Are they strong enough? Have they got gaps?
I think obviously the starting point is, I think people would have preferred to see an outright ban on the keeping of primates as companion animals by private individuals. But in lieu of that, we have what we have. And, you know, I think we want to see the licensing regime as robust as possible. And some of the concerns are around what the enforcement regime is generally from the point of view of local authorities. You know, is there going to be appropriate expertise from those who are carrying out the license inspections? What's the training like around that, and what resources? We know local authorities are already really stretched, and there are issues raised around enforcement of licensing conditions on animal activities generally. So I think those are the areas of most concern. Would you say, Marcia?
Yes, I mean, enforcement, and there will be the next webinar from 42 is on enforcement, and it's a widespread problem. in animal welfare. We have really good animal welfare laws compared to other countries, but the problem is we're not enforcing them.
Yeah.
And that's about resources, it's about money, it's about commitment, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I thought was about this is to have only 2 checks within a period of 6 years. I mean, a lot can go wrong during that time, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so not what animal welfare people wanted, advocates wanted, but try and make it work.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the message with this, as with most other provisions in this bill, is we just want to see it passed.
Yes. All right, let's we're now going to look at live exports. So Paula, tell us about the welfare issues behind the provisions in respect of live exports.
Again, no real big surprises here, that a number of reports, including the recent review by the European Court of Auditors, has found weaknesses in the enforcement of welfare provisions for animals who are being exported for live journeys, or live exports for long journeys. This affects a huge number of animals every year, and so it's an area of real animal welfare concern. There has been huge public support for a ban on live exports for many years now, and so there was enthusiasm when this provision was raised in the Kept Animals Bill. So again, it's another area that I think has both cross-party and public support.
All right, so let's look at provisions. Essentially, the bill bans all exports of relevant livestock, which is quite remarkable, and it's a big change. Relevant livestock are defined as cattle, bovines, horses, and other equines, sheep, goats, pigs, and wild boar. And there's been lots of amendments to that list as the bill has been travelling through the House of Commons. So that might or might not change again, get bigger, get smaller. It creates an offence for doing any of that, for doing any exports of live animals. And it is for slaughter or fattening for slaughter. The penalties are stronger, actually, than in some of the other bill's provisions. Maximum 51 weeks custodial, or a fine, or both. It also allows for very wide-ranging enforcement provisions, again, depending on whether or not they're going to be finalised and organised, but conferring wide powers of inspection, entry without a warrant, using reasonable force, revocation of licenses for transportation, and it creates criminal sanctions for breach of the regs, as well as civil sanctions like injunctions. So, Paula, that's really what animal welfare groups have been advocating for, isn't it? To ban all live animals being transported and exported abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was good to see the proposals include export for slaughter and fattening for slaughter, so that didn't create a loophole. So we'd say, oh, it's for fattening, but then they're going on to slaughter. So that was to be welcomed. I think there are a few species that are not included, such as rabbits, my last look. But, you know, on the whole, again, it's a popular and well supported provision that people want to see it get over the line.
Just one issue about it, and I think this is an issue generally about some of the things in the Act, and the role of, I know there are concerns about the role of Northern Ireland acting as a conduit into Ireland now that we have left Europe. Is that something that we're going to have to look out for in respect, if this bill comes into law, in respect again of enforcement and making sure that the act then that it would be, the law is being upheld. That's going to be quite difficult, isn't it?
I think that's going to be an issue across many measures, not only animal welfare measures, but it seems as if the authorities are cognizant of them and taking steps to try and close any loopholes. So we would have to wait and see, I think, on that one.
Yeah.
Much wider issue, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, and there's the whole issue of the what's going to happen at the end of the year when the sunset clause on rural hits.
Yeah.
All right. So we're going to look at pet theft, and this is designed specifically for certain things. Can you talk us through that, Paula?
Yes, I mean this one it didn't meet with universal support when the proposals were launched for a separate pet theft offence, but actually I think it's a really important one. And the issue here is there was a lot of concern, particularly over the COVID lockdowns, about the fear of dogs in particular being taken, people out walking their dog, they were being snatched, or dogs going missing from people's homes. And the Theft Act, of course, provides authority to deal with people who steal dogs or other animals, but in fact the animals are treated as any other chattel or type of property under the Act. And so when it comes to sentencing, the sentencing powers are often very low. They don't reflect the impact on the family, the distress caused, and they don't reflect any animal welfare impacts necessarily. The sentencing guidelines do mean that you can take into account the impact on the victim, but within a low threshold or a low threshold category where the value of the property is low. And very often our dogs are valued to us, but they fall under the £500 threshold. So the government set up a task force, a pet theft task force, that reported in 2021. And it was really interesting because not only did it address the need for a separate offence, but it was also there was some interesting comments about the language that we used, whether we should be talking about pet abduction, because you're taking someone from the family rather than lumping animals in with other inanimate types of property. So that was quite interesting. For anyone who wants to understand more about it, I've put the link in the slides to the podcast episode we did on this with John Cooper QC. And there have been some really good campaigners working on this and looking at those arguments around having a separate offence, because this is really one that's not met by the sentencing guidelines.
Thanks, Paula. So the provisions in the bill create an offence of taking a dog or keeping a dog from the lawful control of another. Now, unless you are you're married or a civil partner or a parent or in a parent-child relationship, or you're a sibling of the full or the half-blood, according to the Act, then it's not an offence. So it's quite interesting from a family law perspective, because when people get divorced, lots of times now they're arguing about their dogs and the cats and who owns the dog and the cats. Lawful control, taking a dog from the lawful control of another. Lawful control is actually, it's quite tricky, isn't it, Paula? Because you've already said it's a possession, so it can come under theft. But I know one of the requests for advices we get in chambers is often, well, this is a set of circumstances, who owns the dog? And sometimes it's a question of a matter of fact, isn't it? It's who is it chipped?
Yep.
Who chipped it? Who bought it? Was it bought as a family pet? So it's not as straightforward as lawful control, is it? I mean, it's somewhat of a question of fact, in addition with some legal parameters.
Yeah.
Importantly, although it creates formally creates an offence of taking a dog, the bill also has powers to extend the provisions to other animals. It's quite interesting to see the basis and the criteria for extending it to other pets. And the sections talk about powers to extend provisions to other animals commonly kept as pets, but only if that species is capable of forming a bond to its keeper, and evidence that removing that bond will adversely affect the animal's well-being. Now that creates a whole range of issues about recognizing the animal as sentient. So it feeds into the Animal Sentience Act, which was passed, I think last year now. And it looks at animals differently, doesn't it, then, that section. So I was thinking, the next animal is going to be a cat, isn't it? And then I think, well, how do you lawfully control a cat? That does what it wants most of the time. But also it recognizes that there are bonds between animals and humans that negatively impact on the animal or positively impact on its well-being. So that's an interesting aspect of this piece of legislation, I think. The penalties, because you were talking about penalties, and the driving force behind this was the lack of proper penalties or sentencing. The penalties are imprisonment or fine or both to a maximum for either offence for summary conviction, 6 to 12 months, depending on where we are with a particular piece of sentencing legislation, but up to 5 years imprisonment if you're convicted on indictment in the Crown Court. So they're quite much more powerful, aren't they, than what you were talking about previously and what generated it. So, Paula, what do we think? Is this an act that meets the concerns that generate it? Is this a bill, a provision that's going to meet these concerns?
I think it does, actually. And I think one of the crucial points will be about cats. And I mean, possibly other animals as well, but does your cat form a bond with you? Does your cat like you, or does it just care who's feeding the cat?
Yes.
I find this whole area really fascinating, and I'm sure cat owners will have different experiences of this and what they think about cat species, and they're capable of forming bonds with us. But it's a different way of looking at things, as you say, and I think that's to be really welcomed.
But on that issue, I mean, it creates some evidential problems, doesn't it? Are we going to be getting experts in to say, well, my cat was upset because my partner took him away from me? How are we going to prove those kinds of things?
I think it must be on a species basis.
It has to be, doesn't it?
It just be around the ability of cats, say, to form attachments with their caregivers. Yeah. It may be easier for cats than rabbits, I don't know, but actually, I know people who have rabbits and guinea pigs and feel they are very attached to them as caregivers. So it will be interesting. It will
be an interesting one, won't it? All right, the next thing we wanted to look at were import restrictions. So can you tell us the welfare drivers behind that?
Yeah, import restrictions are really interesting. So people may not be as aware of the motivation behind this particular provision, and it really relates predominantly to issues around, well, there are two. One is around puppy farming, and the second one is around ear cropping. So there are restrictions based on age, and that's about trying to raise the threshold to make it easier from an enforcement point of view to spot the age of a dog that's coming in. So it's easier to spot a 6-month-old than it is a 12-week-old. There had already been substantial amendment of the licensing regime around the breeding and sale of dogs. We had Lucy's law that followed that amended the licensing regulations to tighten those up so that you can't sell a puppy by a third party, so it should be sold the bitch. And what the problem is that remains is that while you have a good domestic system, you have puppies being imported from low welfare countries abroad, and so that has to be dealt with. It's really important, and it deals with a number of other areas where there are disease transmission risks. Tied up in this whole area, those issues around fertility clinics, dogs with extreme conformations, and Nature Watch have been doing some fantastic work on that for anyone who wants to know more about this. And there are a number of related areas around consumer protection, puppies being sold in poor health, dying prematurely, people who have spent a lot of money on puppies that have these particular issues, maybe behavioural issues because of poor socialisation. So that's one part of it. And there's a link in the slides there to a really good Panorama documentary recently about this that looks at some of the overlapping issues here. The next issue, which I think is on the next slide, is around ear cropping. And so what we have seen is a rise, it seems, in the number of dogs being imported with these cropped ears. You can see in this photo here what the cropped eared dogs look like. You can see with pointy ears that they have. It would be unlawful to carry out this type of cosmetic mutilation in the UK. So it'd be unlawful under the Animal Welfare Acts. But of course, someone can then say, oh, well, I've imported this dog from a country where it isn't illegal. And so the Act gives some power to deal with that. Now, again, this is an area where there's been a lot of public awareness recently, mainly due to efforts started by the FOAL group, that's the Focus on Animal Law group, who have done some amazing campaigning work in this area, raising awareness, and that's been picked up by some of the larger groups, RSPCA and others, who have really been, supportive of trying to tackle this issue through legislation. So there are lots of issues about that. And again, I've put a link up for anyone who wants to have a deeper dive.
Great. Thank you, Paula. Because the other thing about ear cropping as well is there's quite a lot of trendiness around them within a certain population of young men, aren't they? Not only using them as security dogs, but they're seen as a status symbol as well, aren't they? That's
right. And unfortunately also the normalization of that through commercial ventures as well. And I think that's starting to be recognized, how media outlets are using these images of dogs with cropped ears to portray a tough security type breed, and that not really reflecting the reality of the pain and suffering that's caused to these animals. And the injury can be lifelong. So if an animal has sore ears, it may be difficult it may be more resistant to being touched, it may be more reactive. So there's a long-term impact potentially on those animals.
Provisions in the bill are aimed at regulating non-commercial movement of pet animals. There's a big debate on what number they should be restricted to. And the bill actually deals with dogs, cats and ferrets, doesn't it? They are the relevant animals under the provisions. And it restricts the number of bringing them into the UK to 5. I know that there was a big argument in the Commons about it. It's a big debate in the Commons about the Labour Party. I think the opposition tried to amend this to bring this down to 3, but that failed on a vote, I think. So the restriction is 5 dogs, 5 cats, 5 ferrets. It is the maximum. There will be enabling regulations to prohibit or restrict importation of animals below a certain age. It defines animal mutilation of an animal as a procedure which involves interference with the sensitive tissues or bone structure of the animal, otherwise than for the purpose of its medical treatment. So ears on dogs is what type of mutilation that it's looking at, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there will be regulations to control if an importation at a certain, if an animal is at a certain stage of pregnancy. And again, that hasn't been defined yet. So this section of the bill allows for regulations to be made under the section to create criminal offences. So we're not there yet. And it allows regulations to be made to set penalties. And it looks like the penalty will be an imprisonment or fine to either summary conviction of 6 to 12 months, depending on where we are with the Sentencing Act, or up to 5 years imprisonment on conviction of indictment. So again, that's quite a tough penalty. Yeah. So this seems to be quite an effective provision.
Yeah.
Do you agree, or do you think there's, again, missing?
No, I agree, actually. I think, you know, the animal protection community would largely be saying, let's get this over the line. We need these provisions, and we need them now. Need them sooner rather than later, because the longer you leave it, the more dogs are going to, and other animals as well, are going to be suffering.
Yeah. So those are the main things in the bill that we've looked at. We have to wait and see, don't we, if the government is going to press on.
Yeah.
And we're coming up to, well, election talk. I think there's a fear, isn't there, that this bill might get put back until after the election, because it's still got a way to go, hasn't it? It's
got to get through this parliamentary term, because it's already been carried over once. And so that's the issue. Are we really going to have enough parliamentary time for this? It doesn't go through, we start all over again. That's not what anyone wants.
No, because actually it does have across the division support, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
So it does seem as if all parties want it. It is just a question of getting it over the line, as you say.
Yeah, it's got to have the political will to get it over the line now.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably enough on the kept animals bill. Shall we look now briefly at the trophy hunting bill?
Yeah.
So well, this is, Paula, isn't it? This is got a big debate going on, you know, hunting versus conservation of the animal being hunted. So talk us through a little bit about the problems behind the hunting trophy bill.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is an area you would think would be actually really uncontroversial. And in fact, there is a great deal of public support for banning the import of trophy hunts. There has been an argument that's been made about whether actually it's going to have a negative conservation impact. I really can't see it. I think there are a number of good policy reasons why it needs to be, there needs to be a ban, and why I don't think those conservation threats are so real. We talk about it again in the podcast episode that we had with Eduardo Gonçalves, who's been leading the campaigning on this, and Professor David Bilchitz from South Africa, who addresses some of those issues, as well as issues around whether the UK is taking a colonial stance on these issues. And he very deftly deconstructs those arguments, and I couldn't do them justice here today, but in fact I think they're really convincing, and I think this is a direction that we really do need to go in, and we need to be a world leader in this area. And David's very good at explaining the ethical issues as well, about not compromising individuals for the sake of this amorphous definition of what the species needs are as well.
This bill is one step on from the kept animal bill, because this is through the House of Commons, had its first last month, I think the 20th, it went through up to the House of Lords. It's had its first reading in the House of Lords and awaiting a date for its second reading. So it looks like this will get through before we get to an election.
Fingers crossed.
You think? All right. It's a short bill, isn't it? In some ways, it kind of does what it says on the tin, or does it? Provision-wise, it prohibits the importation of hunting trophies into Great Britain. So it's a prohibition, it's a ban. And hunting trophies defined as a body of an animal or a readily recognizable part of a derivative of an animal. So we're talking about heads, the whole animal. And it applies to, well, it applies to a lot of animals, doesn't it? It applies to animals within Annex A or B of one of the European Council directions. But what it does include, and there are more, but I'm not going to go through all of them, it's all primates, whales, dolphins, all cats, leopards, tigers, all bears, elephants, all rhinoceros, all the kind of animals that we know get hunted.
Yeah.
There's a specific, again, to deal with Northern Ireland, a specific blocking of trying to use Northern Ireland to bring trophies in. That's in the bill. And we've looked at that previously. What I think is an addition when it went through the Commons was a creation of an advisory body to the Secretary of State. And that advisory body, which was mandatory, was to advise the Secretary of State on any question relating to the Act, which the Secretary of State wants them to look at, and on any matter relating to the import of hunting trophies derived from species of animal which appear to the Secretary of State to become endangered or likely to be. So there's provision there to extend as is thought necessary. So this creation of an advisory body, that was an amendment, wasn't it? So it kind of waters down the bill a little bit in some ways, but also widens up the powers, doesn't it?
Yes, I think it has the potential to create flexibility, but we really have to see how it's used as a vehicle.
Yeah. But otherwise, again, if it's enforced, if it's backed, then it's a good piece of legislation from an animal welfare perspective.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So the next thing we're going to look at is the Animals Low Welfare Activities Abroad bill, which is quite a mouthful.
It's a mouthful.
It's a mouthful, isn't it? So tell us what the issues are behind that.
It is a mouthful. This bill is designed to tackle the practice to have the low welfare tourist attractions abroad, and specifically those that have the commonality of features where animals are taken from the wild, often very young, can be taken prematurely from their family unit, often with brutalized training methods to subjugate them and try to domesticate them. The image that we have here on the right is of a baby elephant who is being subjected to what's called a pajan, a breaking of the spirit technique that is recognized as one of those more brutalizing practices. And the work that has been done in terms of raising awareness has been largely through the efforts of Save the Asian Elephant Stay, which is led by a lawyer, Duncan McNair, who's been doing really great work in this area, and supported by other groups who are obviously concerned about the commonality of those welfare features that I've described in relation to other species as well, whether that's orcas, big cats appearing with photo opportunities, in the avian world of parrots and macaws, animals who are really taken from the world and used for tourist attractions with those brutal training methods. So this bill is really aimed at those practices as far as it can within the UK jurisdiction that we have. We obviously have no jurisdiction over other nations. And so I'll pass over to you, Marcia, to tell us, what bright idea people came up with to try and help and support this.
Well, it's a really interesting approach, isn't it? But it's basically what the bill does is make it an offence to either sell. I think there might be a slide coming up in a minute to tell us. It makes it an offence to either sell, advertise, also publish, print, distribute these types of activities within the UK. So it's basically aimed at tourist companies and the like, isn't it? It's aimed at the tourist industry. Low welfare activities are defined as activities which subject an animal to treatment that would be an offence within the UK. So in effect, in England, under our Animal Welfare Act 2006, and in Northern Ireland, the Animal Welfare Act 2011. And the bill makes provision to set out regulations to specify certain activities. So it could be something like elephant riding or something, make them specific. So we'll get a much more specific list. And the fascinating thing about it, of course, is the penalties come under the Consumer Rights Act, because this is about selling goods and services, isn't it? It's not specifically about animal welfare. So unusually for animal welfare, we've talked about the difficulties with enforcement. And the penalties are fines, and you can and also fines for companies as well. So company directors and partners, etc., they are liable for the offences. But unusually for animal welfare legislation, we've already got an enforcement system set up under the Consumer Rights Act, haven't we? Yeah. Run by the local Weights and Measures Department. And Schedule 5 in the Consumer Rights Act contains really massive wide powers to investigate. Time limits don't apply, so they can, continue to gather information as much as they want. So it's a bill which is very wide-ranging and differently has an enforcement system already set up, which works. It does work under the Consumer Rights Act. So again, Paula, this is an interesting way to try and put abroad animal welfare legislation, which is UK based, really.
Yeah, and I think again there's a lot of support for this bill. It's a popular bill. I think the last petition that's run on this issue has had over 1 million signatures. So there is huge public support for this. So we really, again, want to see this over the line.
Yeah. All right, look, Paula, I think we've come to the end, haven't we, of what we were going to discuss tonight. And we've got a few minutes for some questions. One question has come up in the box from an anonymous person. What constitutes a trophy? Would this prohibit importation of skin rugs? How flexible is the bill? That's quite interesting.
Hadn't thought of skin rugs, actually. Yeah.
I hadn't thought of skin rugs, because the definition, I think we went through the definition, didn't we? Which was an animal or a recognizable piece of an animal, so a rug. But then I suppose, well, we'll have to look into that. I think that's a very interesting question.
Yes.
My guess is it doesn't, but I'm not 100% sure why, as a lawyer. But again, this is the kind of, one of the things interesting about looking at the bills as they're going through Parliament is, as a lawyer, you can start spotting things. Well, how is that actually going to work in practice if it becomes legislation?
Yeah. No, that's a really interesting question. It may fall under the fur provisions.
Yeah, we'll have to have a look at that.
Yeah.
I'll put an email together when I've looked at that, and if whoever that was, if they want to send an email address to us, we'll answer it that way.
Been really interesting discussion, actually, Marcia, and you can see there's a lot of support for these bills, and we're just really hopeful that we'll have some progress.
Well, thank you for all your help, Paula, and thank you to everybody for joining and watching, and look out for the webinar, and thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Speak to you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.